Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of Building Bridges, and a few more sessions to go before we end this amazing conference. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Valerie Remokilio-Yeni. I am the CEO of a foundation called Fourfold that's based here in Switzerland, and we are focused on philanthropic grant making and impact investing in the areas of food systems and nature-based solutions. This afternoon, we're in a panel discussing the journey from ideation to investability. How do we get our ventures, our early stage ventures, to attract capital? How do we get these impact ventures from A to B? Before we do that, and before I actually get into the discussion with an amazing panel, introduce them to you, I wanted to get a feeling for who is in the room with us today. So if you can indulge me with a small roll call, I'm going to call up different types of organizations that might be represented in the audience. And if you could just raise your hands to self-identify. So who are the foundations and philanthropists in the audience, if there are any? Thank you very much. Who might be representatives of governments and DFIs in the room? They're still on their way in. Who might be early stage investors, early stage impact investors? Thank you very much. You might also be later stage investors, I know that. What about commercial investors and fund managers in the audience? Do we have any? Also still on their way here from coffee. The next ones. What about the impact ventures or the social entrepreneurs themselves? Okay, wow, we actually have a few in the audience. NGOs, think tanks, policy actors. Okay. It's good to know that we actually have quite a spread of very important players. There are a few missing, but nonetheless, we might be able to have them in the audience later. And we certainly draw on your expertise and your insights as well when we do our Q&A. So when we talk about this journey from idea to investments, we actually come with a visual. It's a journey that starts with analyzing a system, understanding the needs in a space, that heads towards ideation, that gets into validation, importantly also building a business model, and eventually scaling that business model. To get us there, there are also a variety of steps that need to be taken from an entrepreneurial support side. We need incubation, we need validation, we need acceleration. And through all this, we probably also need some TA support from all of our investors and funds. We also need a variety of financial actors from philanthropy, from governments. Sadly, not all of them are here today to join us, but that's also an interesting component. What about early stage impact investors, also DFIs and banks, and eventually investors and other funds? We also have financial supporters for every type of stage of the journey we're in, from raising grants, subsidies, maybe receiving awards, all the way to the pre-seed, seed, Series A, Series B, Series C, how many more funding rounds that we go through. To get through that, we need this constellation of actors in the ecosystem. Some of them are represented today by people in our panel. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves as well. So without further ado, maybe I hand it over now first to Didi from NView. Tell a bit about yourself, your organization, and where you are in this capital stack.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here today with us. I'm Diewertje Nelissen. You can also call me Didi. I'm the Executive Director of NView. And as NView, we believe in an economy that serves people and planet. And to realize that economy, we build ventures, impact ventures, and we do that actually as acting as a founder. So we really start from zero, bringing them from ideation towards investability, and ultimately with the aim to drive systems change in the system. And we do this globally.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Laura Hemrika. I'm the CEO of the Julius Baer Foundation, based here in Switzerland, in Zurich, and delighted to be with you all. At Julius Baer Foundation, so the foundation is an independent foundation, obviously associated closely with Julius Baer Bank, but funded by a number of different kinds of funders, the bank, but also foundations, ultra-high net worth individuals. And we focus on the topic of wealth inequality. And we do that through two types of interventions. We fund innovative projects in mostly low-income countries that in their design and in their implementation work across the wealth spectrum. The other thing that we do is try to use our position as a foundation associated with a bank to really leverage our social capital, our network, and our connections to be able to find more funding and more resources for not just our partners, but also for the topic of wealth inequality.
Hello, thank you all for coming. I'm Amanda Turner-Ege. I'm an executive director at Alea. Alea is a philanthropic impact investor that invests in early growth stage companies to alleviate poverty. We're usually an equity investor trying to help companies scale. And not only do we invest capital, but we partner with the entrepreneurs over a 3 to 10 year period to help them grow their ventures.
Hello, everyone. My name is Patrick. I'm the CEO and founder of iGravity. We believe in the power of entrepreneurship to solve global challenges. And iGravity is an impact investment manager. We provide financing and assistance to small and medium-sized companies in the global south. We lend to them over 3 to 6 years, in some cases on more commercial terms, in some cases linking the terms and conditions to outcomes this company generates.
Thank you very much for that short introduction about where you are at in this journey that an entrepreneur might take. And speaking of that journey, it's very tempting to think that it's actually one that has a very linear trajectory, where it's very clear how we move from A to B, where it's very clear how we go from strength to strength, and how we progress and raising different forms of capital as we go along. The reality actually looks a lot different. So for many entrepreneurs, that's a very turbulent ride with many ups and downs, with a lot of unpredictability. And which is why it's so important to actually have the right stakeholders and impact investors to join you in that journey. So that's what we're trying to unpack today. What is it like to be able to take to a venture from idea to investability? What is the right skill set? What are investors looking for? And how we also develop together with these ventures with the right support. So I'm going to jump into the first question for this panel. First, by moving to that slide. So if we were to ask you about what to prioritize for your impact ventures, is it about staying with grant funding as long as possible, or is it moving them towards investments as soon as possible? So maybe we can nuance it by you saying it from the perspective of your organization and also the learnings and the opportunities that you see. With that, maybe Laura,
as the pure grant giver on the panel, I think I get to kick off. Yes, so from where we sit, we fund early stage, truly initiatives or organizations, some that are really starting still at the idea, where you've got a couple of smart people with maybe a very small pilot or just a concept in mind. And so for us, that's grant money all the way. And absolutely there are always solutions where we hope there's going to be able to, that we can get to a level of sustainability, of financial sustainability. But we see from where we come in that it takes a long time. We fund usually 3 to 6 years. And even at that point, if you're really starting from a very early stage with a vision and an idea, now, not every project we fund starts like that. Some already have a little bit of track record, but nevertheless, in the markets where we are active, things take a long time. And so that's one thing. The other, I encourage people not to underestimate the time that grants take, but also the value of those grants. And if you compare it a little bit to really the startup world or the venture world, in the end, you also don't want to give up ownership of your company in that space either. With grants, you maintain more control of your organization, of your mission, of the impact that you're trying to achieve. So on our side, while we certainly want to work towards different forms of capital and maturity of the organization, we're all about the grants on our side.
And what about you, Amanda at Ilea?
Yes, so as a mostly equity investor, we would say get to investment as soon as possible. And the reason, first of all, it is more nuanced than just saying investment or grants, because along the investment continuum, it isn't a clear order. You can have an equity investor and then a grant investor and a debt investor, and you can mix all the forms of capital as you go along to use whatever instrument best benefits your venture at the time. That being said, we believe it's best to have an equity investment as soon as possible. One, because it sets the intention for the business. If you can rely on grants, you're not necessarily as disciplined as you would be if you know that you're eventually having to get to a profit and a return. And second of all, the other point for investment as soon as possible is when you bring on an investor that really wants to partner with you for the long haul, they're looking with you at eye level on how you're growing your company. They're going to partner with you for 3 to 10 years to make sure that your company can survive and become sustainable. And it's that value that they're also adding to you either on the board level or as an advisor, mentor, and friend that allows your company to survive and become sustainable in the long term.
Didi,
Can
any
I
comments?
challenge already?
Okay.
Am I allowed to challenge?
Okay. A quick rebuttal from Julius Baer. Please, Laura.
No, a very friendly rebuttal. This is some of the discussion we were having around this topic, and of course we're shoehorning ourselves a little bit in some of these positions for the sake of conversation, but there is an element of if you're starting your organization, if you have a vision towards sustainability. There's an element of your business model, so to speak, needs to have that built in from day one. And so for us, in theory, then there's practice, but in theory, as you're evaluating an organization for even grant investment, if the point of that organization is to get to business sustainability, hopefully that doesn't change so much based on the kind of capital that you're getting, and that in fact they're being smart and saying this is zero cost capital, so run.
Didi, what do you think about this?
Yeah, so as a venture builder, we actually see the whole spectrum of funding. So we work with grants, we work with investors, we work with debt. So we see the benefits of all of them and the downsides. And well, now I got to choose, right? So, and then I would actually take the grants. And the reason for it is that, in my opinion, it's the most patient capital we can get. So I look at it in that sense a little bit similarly to what you say. Like, if the aim is really clear that it should be a self-sustaining venture in the end that delivers the impact, but in a way that it can commercially thrive as well, I do believe that grants are really important to also ensure you get to that impact model. Because if you really want to make a change, especially if you think on the systems level where we are active as well, it's not that easy. And we know investments give a good incentive for your commercial model. But at the same time, if you really want to stick with the issue and ensure you solve that one, we need the patient capital. And honestly, we haven't seen that many investors that are ready for it. So if you're there, I'm more than happy to welcome you. But I think grants are still very relevant in this.
Anything to add, Patrick?
Yes, I wasn't sure what my colleagues would say, to be honest, on this question, but I need to say I'm totally aligned with Amanda. I also feel it's a bit of a personal question because it's obviously biased by, in my case, by my journey and what I have done, but I am also firmly believing that raising investments is probably more helpful for an impact venture, assuming the impact venture is a private commercial company, because you can also have an impact venture as an NGO with a hybrid model. But in our case, for example, at Gravity, we have been raising money as well. We have raised money twice, and going out and trying to sell your vision and convince people around that and discuss with different investors has been super helpful to keep focus and discipline. Assuming you find investors that are aligned with what you do, so they fully understand that you are in also to generate impact and they are patient, But if you find this kind of investors, I'm totally in for the investment part.
It's very interesting. We have actually, in the end, quite an agreement here of the kind of quality of capital that we want to use. What is interesting to me is nonetheless to reflect on at what point do you feel is a venture ready for something else? At which point do you feel they have to transition out of grants and then can be presented to more impact-aligned investors as well? So a question of readiness. How do we know we've arrived to that point of readiness? What's the feeling? Didi, would you like to start?
Shall I kickstart? Yeah. So technically speaking, what we use is an impact investment readiness framework even. And I would say it's quite similar to any investment readiness framework that you would see in terms that you would look at the traction. So is the desirability there, the customer base? Is there a proof of concept? How is it doing in terms of unit economics, etc.? And above all, team, right? So team is a make it or break it. And then on top of that, we look at the impact. Like, what's the impact generated? What's the impact potential? I would say one change is that we look at profitability slightly differently. So I think we are more patient in that sense on the commercial end. But if I boil it down, like, when are you ready for investability? It's quite interesting because I think I've never seen one of the ventures ticking all the boxes fully. So ultimately, what's really relevant is, again, this team, having the right people, having a very clear vision where you're working towards, and a plan to reach that vision. And then again, the team who can execute it. And if I also look at some of our ventures that got invested in quite early on, like SocoFresh is one of them in Kenya, the first investors came on board for these reasons. They thought the vision was the one they agreed with. They also saw the solution had unit economics working. There was some proof of concept, but it was also because they were believing in the team. And yes, we still had to tick quite some boxes, but they went for it. So I think it's also, in the end, boiling down to those things.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, because when you don't have those in place, we've seen also where things can fall down, right? Having that, and here, you know, some of the points that were made earlier, I also concur with, of course, which is if you don't have the team that creates an organization that has a vision, that is a founder, is not always the best team to grow. And this is in the for-profit or the non-profit world, right? And we have seen firsthand in some situations that some of the organizations we've supported have gone a little too bold too early, and then taken on even a loan, but under terms that were not that favorable for them, and then actually set themselves back by then having a financial burden that they had to carry with them when they were not yet ready to do that, because actually their growth plan or unit economics were not there yet. And this is where, indeed, you need to have a really strong growth plan and business plan for your organization. But one of the things where you also know that where you do know you're ready to go is that in many cases, philanthropists are not able to continue funding you at a certain point, right? Then all of a sudden they're like, okay, you're now a for-profit entity. Maybe you've transformed your status or whatever it might be, or you need to go in directions that not that many foundations are comfortable funding. Now, there are exceptions like Alea that's very forward-thinking, but not every foundation is quite that flexible in how it looks at the kind of organizations it's ready to fund.
Who would like to add their own criteria for investment readiness here?
Should I go? So I think investment readiness may mean different things to different investors. To me personally, I think fundraising is relevant when you have a plan, when you're planning to do something. So it comes down to the ability to actually execute this plan. And we all know that plans are often meant not to be fully executed as originally planned. So we know in an entrepreneurial journey, many things happen that make you change the direction or do things differently, whether it's an external context or clients or supplier. I think what is important is the resilience then of the business, of the team, so the ability to generate revenues in different ways. And I also agree that there is not necessarily a linear order of what type of financing you need. So it's not always grant, equity, and loans, but depending on what the plan is, you can also raise equity and debt, and then you raise grants, depending on what you're planning to do. For example, we have been working with an edtech company which has scaled successfully, raising equity and working in the Middle East, especially with private school students. And at some point, they decided to roll out their offering to public school students in more rural areas. And for that, they have been raising grant money much later than investment. And that made totally sense at that moment.
I would just like to echo the team piece for the entrepreneurs in the room. What we look for is someone who's stubborn enough to see their vision through to completion, to make sure they can actually execute it, but also modest enough to know when they can't and they need help and what kind of help they need. And I think when we're looking at the checked boxes, like, yes, we want to see unit economics, yes, we want to see a plan, we want to see the ability to scale, but more than anything, we want to see the entrepreneur being able to drive that through and be able to say, I I'm not great at financial modeling. I need to hire a CFO as soon as possible. Or, I'm not the best at doing the sales myself anymore because it's above what I can sell and I need to hire a salesperson. And so we spend a lot of time really getting to know the entrepreneurs to make sure that they are self-aware enough to be able to make those decisions in hard moments.
I think there's an interesting piece here of talking about first this probably relationship of trust that then you're trying to cultivate with the ventures and the entrepreneurs, because that's what's going to see you through these transitions, through this turbulence, and maybe the flexibility that you need to be able to adapt, whether it's grants or loans or equity that you need at a certain stage. What have been for you the key challenges to actually work with teams and with these organizations? Have there been moments where you feel is it a skills gap that they tend to be missing in early stage ventures? Is it a structural problem about, expanding their teams? Where have you seen these roadblocks in getting them to readiness? And how adaptive have they been to your intervention? This is a wild card. So I'm asking anyone in the audience.
I think you started alluding to it when you mentioned a relationship of trust, because hindsight's always 20/20, and innovation looks great in the rearview mirror and it looks perfect in that nice little curve that you had up front. But we know that it's actually a really messy business, and if anything, especially if you have the luxury of being able to engage for 3 or 6 years, first with grants, it gives you a real opportunity to get to know your partner. But it requires trying to act as equals and really getting to know the organization, both on the ground, but all the nooks and crannies of that organization. Now, the nature of grant giving is often that it feels like an uneven power dynamic. So I think it's the onus of the grant giver to show a flexibility and openness and understanding and put ego aside and approach this with humility to really give space to the organization that you're funding and the team, and to really try to understand what they're doing. If you have any hope in someone being entirely transparent with you on, look, we're stuck here, here's a mistake, and how much a team is able to grow from that and actually take that head on tells you a lot about whether or not that you should ever invest in them in any other way where there is a different contractual.
As well.
Yeah, exactly.
Does anybody want to add about how they've been working with teams? What challenges have they seen? Amanda's mentioned, maybe it's about the lack of financial know-how. Maybe it's a lack of a CFO, for example. And how have you overcome it? And how are those difficult conversations going when they happen?
Yeah, I think Alea was very lucky enough to be able to go to IMD Business School for a course called Leading for Impact with our entrepreneurs a few years ago. And one of the takeaways from the course was leadership equals direction plus energy. And what that essentially means is a leader has to provide direction where we want to go. They have to be able to execute, but they also have to manage the energy of their team and give that positive spirit and create that culture. And you can have leadership with one or the other, but when you get both, it's really, really powerful. And what we've seen in ventures that have struggled is that there might be excellent leadership, and it's they can basically force it down your throat that they're going to grow and they're going to achieve, and they will, and they'll be able to get to a certain level of success with just the direction piece. But if they can't build the team around them with the positive energy that they really need to get to the next level of growth, it's really challenging. And so one of the ways that we address that at Alea with our entrepreneurs that are struggling with that aspect is through our entrepreneurs community, where we bring all of our entrepreneurs together globally every few years. And what we've seen is that we can coach the best that we can, but when another entrepreneur can come to you and say, I really struggled with my own ego, with having to get over myself to realize that I'm not the best person for financials or the best person for sales or whatever it is, I realized that I need someone else. I hired someone else, and that person delivered, and that person got me to the next level. It's a much more powerful way to get over that hump. And we've seen that with a few ventures where they connected with another entrepreneur, and then they were like, aha, I finally got it. I need a CFO. And then they hired one, and then they were able to grow quite quickly.
It sounds to me that clearly here, the intervention of Anilea is really going far beyond just the financial inputs, right? This is really where you're building this community for the entrepreneurs, also helping them a lot with their more personal journey as entrepreneurs in a very difficult market. How else, maybe anybody else wants to add to this point about building teams and organizations for growth?
Yes, so something we actually debated outside of sitting here is, so in the venture building model that we have, it means actually you recruit the entrepreneur in certain cases later on. So we have a group of venture builders which are serial entrepreneurs. They ideate these ventures, they build them up, and sometimes they actually move out and they are the CEO, so they have been there from the beginning. But there are also cases where we identify that the team who has done the building initially is not the one going to lead it, because it's quite a different skill to come up with a brilliant idea and to bring it really to scale. So then we also recruit it. So we get a lot of questions about it, like, is it possible to recruit an entrepreneur, right? I mean, even though they invest and they get their shares, is it possible? Well, yes, we have seen that it can work. But of course, you do need to look at the right profile on finding someone that's really also falling in love, in that sense, with the issue you're solving, with the solution, and having the skill set to bring it to the next level. That brings me to the point of two challenges that I have seen. So I have seen impact ventures that are sort of a little bit stuck with the founder who doesn't see that it might be wise to even onboard another CEO. So I just wanted to bring up that topic. And the other way around, one thing we have experienced more, because we have less of that first experience then, as that's the luxury of the model, but finding the entrepreneur, someone next to the CEO that will really be, also be vesting in the company, that can be actually a hard one. Like finding your CFO or your whoever you need next to you. I think that one can be quite challenging to find someone who does that. And I guess what I have seen happening sometimes is that then the CEO is is struggling, because you're building up your team and you're responsible for your sales and your financials and there's always something to do, right? You need to talk to your investors, you want to raise more. So I think one of the challenges that I've seen is on that one, and I do think like a good, having the right investors on board that are also open to think along with you, support in a network, to find that right person next to you is actually a very important one.
Maybe just to add another perspective, I would like to speak about the complexity of all this. You can never really get it right and foresee everything that happens. So we provide loans between 250,000 to $1 million to mid-sized companies in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Senegal. We have people on the ground, local investment people who've spent 3 to 6 months doing due diligence, writing long memos. We think we can, understand everything, and then there's so many things happening. In one case, the CEO got sick, and kind of the leadership, the second line of leadership was really weak, so things stopped for several weeks and months. In another case, we had a processing company in Senegal. There were power problem. They had to stop the production. Again, no cash flow for the company. They couldn't service the debt. There was COVID, so we financed a company was buying a machine from China. With COVID, the prices increased. Everything was more expensive. One of their investors pulled out. We have another company in Uganda who has decided to acquire a smaller player, and then they need all the cash to pay for this acquisition. So these are all things you don't think about until they happen for the first time, and you learn to deal with new situation every time.
It's like going to a street fight. You never know what you're going to get. You just have to do what you have to do with the tools you have on hand, right? What's really interesting for me, and maybe I divert to another question, was just related to, besides the investment readiness of the venture, is also the readiness of the actors who are supporting the venture to say, you know what, we've had our run. This has been an amazing journey of grant making or equity investments. Now we need other players in the room. When do you signal that? And have you, in your experience in the field, found the right people to steward your amazing ventures onto the next level, or to accompany them in that journey where they're at the moment? And how has that environment been like of building that ecosystem as well with investors? Does anybody want to jump in? Amanda?
Yeah, this is something I'm incredibly passionate about, so I'm very happy to jump in here. So one of the things that we're trying to do right now is to understand the players in the space so that for every one of our ventures, we can introduce them to several co-investors along the investment continuum. And it sounds like something that's quite easy to do. We originally created a database of about 500 co-investors that exist in the space, but after like deep diving, what exactly are you looking for? What is exactly the instruments you want to use, the features of the businesses you want to support, the countries, the topics, like all of these different factors, plus that like little feeling of like, do I connect with this entrepreneur? Do I believe this entrepreneur can do it? Is it the right team? We end up being able to introduce currently like 1 to 2 investors per venture of that list of 500. So it's quite challenging. And what's also quite interesting is that I think investors also really struggle to articulate exactly what they're looking for. Like we can make a list of check boxes and say ticket size and say industries and countries, but that soft judgment of like what you actually believe makes a good impact venture, it's very difficult to capture and explain to others. So this is something that if anyone in the room like wants to figure out how to partner or is along that investment continuum for our ventures, I'm very happy to discuss it with you because it's something that we're working very hard to try to do for our investees, but also for the industry as a whole, because once we as investors, and it doesn't matter, grant, equity, debt, whatever, you're all along the spectrum, if we can get this right, it will help ventures grow so much more quickly.
Does anybody want to add about building this ecosystem as well of co-investors?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so definitely that collaboration is an important one that can increase. And it's what I still find interesting, though we're talking already for many years about the missing middle, the valley of death. And I think we have definitely not been able to close it. Because if I look at it, if you talk about when are you ready for the next one, I think it's sort of always a struggle, because even that now there is an ecosystem, quite a group of investors that really do more early stage. But even then, the level of traction that's often looked for is not the level at which usually philanthropy wants to stop giving grants, because once there's traction, there's traction. Is it still philanthropy? It might be commercial, but it's not that commercial, so that's the element I think that's definitely still out there. So actual collaboration would for sure fill that gap. And one thing we have seen as well, there are some organizations also trialing with a bit more innovative funding models, like the convertible grants, the repayables. And we actually have had quite some good experience with those as well, as it goes beyond the restrictions certain funds have. So you are able to deploy a bit longer, but in the ecosystem, there's definitely still a lot to develop, yeah.
I think even if you're exiting as a grant giver, you're not always necessarily exiting to an investor. To your point around flexible instruments, sometimes it's a more mature grant giver. And if we looked at that chart you had up, a lot of the things that we fund are more innovative, more testing new ideas, incubating new ideas, and there's actually still space for another type of more mature grant giver, a larger grant giver to come in after us. But to your question of timing, we try to signal that early enough also to our investees or our grantees, where we try to be systematic after 3 years. Okay, will that organization still benefit from a grant from us? Or are they ready and is there grant money out there that's available for them, that's maybe more mature, can do different things, can provide them with access to more network, et cetera, so that we can free up our own capital to, again, go back to more innovative and newer ventures. But we also consider then at the 3-year mark, but we do it before the actual end of the grant, hopefully 6 months, if not a year before, of like, listen, this is going to just be the 3 years, or no, we're considering the extension, or we're going to give you an exit grant, but under the following conditions, i.e. we need you to beef up your fundraising capabilities or your investment readiness or whatever that might be, so that no one should be getting to the end of that grant with no idea of what's happening next. Yeah. And we also see that, to the point of, it goes beyond funding, and if in our position we can use our network to either provide access or visibility to further funding, whether that's grant or other type of funding, then I think that's part of our role as well.
All right. So you're beginning with the end in mind. You know when to exit before you even start a relationship. How about you, Patrick?
Maybe one comment about the importance of educating the investors as well. I mean, we are discussing a lot about scaling up and mobilizing more private finance, especially in today's context, which obviously means selling the opportunity, good return, limited risk, compelling narrative. But then the reality is different, you know. I mean, we all know about the difficulty and challenges, and finding that fine line is quite difficult, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe one thing I didn't even mention, but so we are active in Europe, but also in African and Asian continent, and I think also there are globally differences, which is important to point out. Like in East Africa, it's quite common to work with the grants, and then you have a certain types of funding mechanisms that are more available to you. Whilst working in Europe, the chances of getting a grant are actually quite small. It might rather be a subsidy you might get to be able to innovate and really do that part. But then there are also different criteria sort of on your risk, but also on the expectations in your commercial side. So I think it's also just good to realize that the challenges are also quite different, in different regions.
It's very place-specific, geographically specific to what is the kind of the funding that's prevalent in that ecosystem, in that community. So grants might be more prolific in, I don't know, in an African context or in a certain region, less in Europe, or more subsidies-based. So that's an important one. I would like now to open up the room for questions, and I see already a few hands there, and to hear from the experts on the ground. Yes. How do we go? Sir, you first. Yes, you have your mics.
Yeah, great. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Fortunate. I'm the founder of Savolution. And you were talking about this continuum between grants and investment, right? From my personal experience, I have more the impression it's more like a minefield than a continuum. And just let me explain what I mean. So, you know, I started our business first as a startup, and then we were basically not able to access grants because you're a commercial entity. Right now, we're trying again as an NGO to do a proof of concept, and the grant givers say, oh, this looks like a startup. We don't give you grants either. So it's like you fall between a rock and a hard place. And what would be your advice in this kind of situation? Thank you.
Well, that's a very interesting real-world example. Does anybody want to take this? What about those hybrids who are a bit in a rock and a hard place? How do you judge that? Anybody want to take this? Didi.
I definitely don't have the silver bullet for you, because I do recognize that. I was mentioning it, like at some point you're seen as too commercial or not commercial enough, like it's a recognizable point. I think definitely there's something then in the end in your narrative, which doesn't mean you really change what you do, but it's more speaking the right language. I know that's not easy, but my own experience is the language of philanthropy and grants is very different from the investor language. So that's just a recommendation I can give, and try to look for people in your network who are having experience there, because it's like just a completely different jargon even. So talking the same language will help, but I'm very curious how you look at it, because you're on the other end of the table. But that's something we definitely have seen, that it's important that you understand. So do you talk about your impact and more about the impact in the issue versus showing it as a pitch deck where you say, hey, this is my traction, look what I will achieve. Like, it's very different, and even I think as well in the way you approach it. But I'm curious what you have to add and how you have lived this.
It's funny you should mention that, because just this week I saw this great sort of post where it said about language. You know, if you let nonprofits write our advertising campaigns, did you see this thing that Volvo would be? And then the language was something around vehicular transportation to move targeted populations towards employment, economic growth, and well-being, or something like this, right? And so to support your points around language, I think what we lack in this sector is also this clarity on who funds what where, and where funders approach organizations thinking around what are we trying to achieve and what is the kind of capital that an organization needs. But I don't know enough about your business to give very specific pointers, but that's.
Can I quickly react on that? I think language obviously is very important, and I see that myself. Often people don't communicate, but I believe in my case I can speak both languages because I've been in both worlds, but still some organizations have like hard criteria, right? Then you don't fall in that tick box, then you're out. And that's it, end of story.
Just to add one point there, I'm actually really grateful that you said this point, because I think here at Building Bridges, we're in this bubble where everyone is speaking the same language around like businesses are great, let's have impact through business. And it's true that like we're still such a small part of the world's financial capital, and we need to somehow not just talk to each other, but have like a bigger voice to bring more people into this space. And Alea, as a philanthropic investor, we're a foundation that can invest in for-profit companies, but even legally, that has been challenging for a lot of different countries to create foundations that are allowed to make equity investments. And that's just changing now. Like a lot of, for instance, the Canton of Zurich now allows that to happen more broadly. And so this is a legal framework as well that needs to change. So thanks for bringing up the point.
I know there are a few more questions in the audience. I think I'm going to go first to the lady here in front.
Thank you so much. And this is a fascinating opening because my name is Johanna Suleta. I host a forum in London and in Davos bringing new initiatives. And it's called The Art of Creating Value. But most recently, I was also in New York. And part of what I have been championing is this transformation. So I tell you what I have captured from my side and the people that I have spoken with or give platform to. The Americans have a conversation that's very advanced, not all of them, but certain philanthropic groups. And there's a movement that's being created, and happy to connect you with, that, for example, they are championing indigenous-led funds. This is a fascinating example because indigenous who are doing the most protection of nature cannot write 250 pages for an application. So it's how the relationship between these middle translators, it's happening to enable that the people that need the funds the most can get them without all these hurdles. And listening to that side. But of course, the most important thing is the relationship. So once you have a connection with the communities, is wanting to really support that communities and seeing how we are modifying our rules to evolve in that direction to be able to do more. Also, another problem that the indigenous communities have, specific on this example, is that sometimes the NGOs have their own issues, they get their money decimated, and much, much later. So another advancing point that is happening is having direct connection between the capital and the communities. And so there are many things that are being adjusted. Now in New York, last week, there was this other side of philanthropy that's being evolved. But I am also in conversation with many institutions, and someone from one of these major philanthropic forces in the US is putting together the World Bank, the Rockefeller, the Walton, so that once you have also those major institutions shifting and speaking about trust-based capital, I don't know if that's terminology you've come across here.
Trust-based philanthropy, yes.
Yes, exactly. So that we start to move more and more with the consciousness of the sector, and other institutions follow in that direction once you have those major voices taking the lead. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment. I think what we're really nailing here is obviously this relationship of trust, and this relationship of listening as well to our partners more closely, and to adapt as well the forms of capital that are needed, that are appropriate for the kind of ventures that are on the ground. So we hear you loud and clear. Maybe there are other questions in the room. Gentleman at the back.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Kevin. I'm currently a student at the University of Geneva, but I was the former entrepreneurship director of Ecuador. And we supported firms, small firms, with debt investment and grants. And one of the most common problems, maybe the most common problem that we had, is that we didn't manage to make these firms do the quality jump from survival-oriented firms to growth-oriented firms. So and we saw impact of our investment in terms of sales, profit, even in costs, but we didn't manage to make them think about for example, we had lots of manufacturing food investment, and they were all, none of them tried to export or try to comply to some of the quality requirements for certain markets because they were oriented to survive, which is valid. But I was wondering if you're, in your experience, what is the main factor that could drive this quality jump? Thank you very much.
That's a really good question. So what is the mark of quality that needs to be there to move them from survival to growth, to scale?
I have I think a reasonable example for where that works, and it goes to this piece around working across the wealth spectrum. So we have a project with an NGO called Codespa, a project working with seaweed farmers in the Philippines, and the intention of the project, because of this idea of where we want those who have power, capital, influence to work, to come into direct contact with those who don't, right? And in this case, you're talking about these seaweed farmers who are doing subsistence farming, just survival level. They're selling their seaweed to middlemen, et cetera, et cetera. What we were able to do through this project was actually get the international company in direct contact with these seaweed farmers in the Philippines, in the community, by introducing them, building more trust, but also more understanding for the seaweed farmers of what they actually needed, which allows the seaweed farmers to supply, do an extra step of the value chain, supply an even better product directly to this buyer, get more income as a result, and the buyer gets better product, and less of the wealth is lost across that value chain. But that came from a really very in-person connection between managers who came from Spain or from Manila and met directly with these seaweed farmers, and they traveled over as well. So really building that direct
So with your
relationship.
philanthropic capital as well, using this to for market building. So with very targeted interventions for market building and opening up an export market for these seaweed farmers. So that for you was the quality jump that was needed here. Amanda, did you want to add something here about quality?
I love the question because it's quite complicated and has so many layers. So I don't have like an easy answer to the question, but just a few thoughts that I can share. Like one, just building that like lower middle level of economic development and having that in an economy already is development and helpful. So for one, I don't think at all that is a failure case just because they didn't scale. Second of all, I think with Alea's perspective, especially, like what that needs is an entrepreneur, like, and not just a local entrepreneur, but someone who has a vision. Like, how are we going to consolidate the industry? How are we going to, do the right marketing, create the right product? And that's where we at Alea love working with entrepreneurs because they have that vision, and that's just something that I think it's, we can debate this more, but I think that's born more than made in some ways. Like you have people who are able to just see the opportunity and seize it, and so I think in that case, you would need an entrepreneur to say, like, let's get these 5 manufacturings together, or let's create this brand, et cetera. And then the last part of that, and this comes from my previous job where we were developing smallholder farmers in Latin America and trying to train the farmers to export. And what we saw is that when we moved the cooperatives to actually export FOB instead of ex-works, like to the port instead of at the farm gate, the quality of their produce went down because they were excellent farmers, but they weren't excellent exporters. And so in order to change, we did this impact study. That's why impact studies sometimes are very valuable. Like we saw, okay, our theory isn't actually working. How do we change it? And they had to hire external managers to manage the export so they could focus on the farming. And so I think in this case, you need the talent, you need the entrepreneur to actually change the mindset to move into essentially a new business.
All right, I'm going to give the floor to the gentleman over there, blue sweater.
Thank you very much. So we're BK, we're an impact company starting to scale. In our experience, in fact, what we see is there is a well-defined financial approach and market for 10x, which is, I want 10 times my capital back. I take a very high risk, and that's actually the hard place we've chosen, meaning, in fact, that's the kind of capital we're going for. The only thing is we need to convince 10x investors that selling to NGOs is not selling to hippies, but okay, that's it, basically. Then we also see 0x, which is foundations. We have to jump through some hoops, so we don't do that so much, but okay, that's the rule for that. Then there is 1 or 2x, which is like loans, or let's say 2x, let's say I lend to a pizzeria or to an impact venture, whatever. In between, I have the impression some people pretend that there is something, but for us it's like a mess. We've not really understood whether, I mean, clearly there's not a 5x or 4x defined. We are like patient capital and so on. It's never been defined, and there is like an empty space between 2x and 10x from our point of view, maybe 3 or 4 for a normal small growth, limited growth company. I was wondering, am I wrong? Is there something better defined between 3x and 10x?
That's a tricky one to answer.
I think 3x is already quite good. So.
I mean, we're talking here about impact ventures as well, right? I mean, working in very difficult markets, very challenging conditions, working mainly with the base of the pyramid in many cases as well. So, I mean, 3x sounds like a good number to me. Does anybody want to react to this spectrum or this gap, it seems, between 3x and 10x?
I guess your comment is more from the investor perspective, right? Not what the business can deliver. So I think it's more like there are different pools of money, obviously, and who manages this money is accountable to someone at the end, you know. So if it's a foundation, you're more accountable on the impact side, and that's why you go for the 0x. While if you're accountable to, you know, in a pension fund or a bank, then it's because you want to have the 10x. And I mean, you're totally right. I totally agree with you. I guess the more flexible money at the end of the day would be probably the family office and foundation money. And that's maybe a change in thinking that is required to show them the opportunity to think in that 5x, which is missing. But I don't know.
All right, we'll move on to one more question from this side, sir.
It's a bit related. It's a bit related to that. I'm hearing kind of like a siloed approach, right? There's grants, there's equity. Why can't we work together? Why can't you work together to maybe find that middle ground?
I mean, I think we very much do. We literally all have co-investments together. So like, I think that was the point at the beginning with this curvy slide and like the choosing investment first or grant first. Like we all think it all happens at the same time. There's ups and downs and times for certain instruments and times for others. So we definitely all collaborate.
And I think the challenge is to have more of these people work together.
Yeah, because
right?
it's still limited, if I may comment on it. So I think actually you are a good example of that it can work if you do it, because it helps a lot, right? What I also mentioned before on patient capital, there's some form of de-risking in it. We even also have some experience with families that have a foundation and they also do investment, and then they, in the end, contribute through both, for example, which is not collaboration, but more like using multiple vehicles at the right time. I just think that's one of the big opportunities still, to collaborate more, because referring to the question before that, I also still think there is a gap. So more often there is a gap than there is not one. So if you could really already earlier on have that conversation on where is the grant best used for and where is the equity best used for, I think it would help a lot. But I guess then we should anyway create a way larger impact capital space. Because in the end, there's still a lot of competition at the moment, right? Impact capital is not that big if you look at who's all seeking it. So that would be the challenge I would sort of put forward as well.
All right. I think we may have room for one final question. Sir in the red sweater.
Thank you. Thank you for this panel. The insights is really interesting. My name is Ginny. I work for Global Solidarity Forum. We're a philanthropic fund. We focus on job creation through employment and entrepreneurship. And I also mentor entrepreneurs in Africa and teach at a business school. First, I'm happy to see a diverse panel, because it's good to see not just 4 old white men talking about the space. So I'm happy about that. But I just got a couple of questions. First one is, I used to work with a patient capital investor and called Acumen, I'm sure you're familiar with. And they did an investigation looking at the portfolio and look at the ones that were scaling up. Was there a common denominator in terms of scaling up? So I'm curious if you've done that work as well, looking at all the investment you've done, whether there was one thing you've noticed, maybe you've mentioned it before, that you felt that, that's very common, no matter the industry, basically, that they do very well, they were able to scale up. And then the second, if you don't mind, I'd love to hear, because I love stories, I'd love to hear what's the most inspiring journey of an entrepreneur you work with, that you've seen the way they went from, maybe ideation to scaling up or different stages. I'm curious to hear from that.
That's a really beautiful wrap-up question as well to close this panel. So if I can invite each panelist to talk about what has been this common denominator that you've seen from your ventures that have stood out as successful ventures, I would say so. And yes, it was a great story about an entrepreneur that you would like to share that inspired you as an impact investor. Who would like to go first? Because these are also really hard questions. What's the secret sauce you've seen in your years of impact investing?
I'll take the hit and go first. So I get an extra prize. I'll use my inspiring entrepreneur example maybe to also point out one of the lessons and something that was mentioned earlier already. We have one project in our portfolio where I want to say fourth or fifth generation Namibian landowner decided to work with the women who are in the community near his land in order to help them develop income generating opportunities, growing jojoba plants and other desert plants that grow well there, and also and integrate them into more international supply chains. And that was started with a grant from our foundation and also a grant from one of our clients. And what started as a very small group, 5 women, who then hired a few other women in the community, that model, people took note, and we were able to then replicate in the northern part of, this was in Swakopmund, and then the northern part of Namibia. What got people really excited was that the oil from jojoba seeds gets, is used to make shampoo and creams and all that kind of thing. So he, the entrepreneur, actually managed to then connect them all the way to one of the big shampoo brands up here in Europe, which is, sounds fantastic, and it is fantastic. But the amount of work that takes, and then especially when you want to get the certification, the bioorganic certification, etc., that is work that these women could not do by themselves. And so he and his team, and the team means his wife and a small other group, are doing it themselves. And they're doing then driving these seeds from northern Namibia in one swoop and one drive, because you're not allowed to let the seeds be out of your site in an environment that is not 100% certified, so he keeps driving all night and brings it back to where it can be shipped, etc. But that is then the great story from isn't this wonderful from an integration perspective into international supply chains. But actually what gets really exciting is what you can do with different seeds right there, because he's then developed several machines that allow you to break these nuts that are, you can break protein for foodstuffs, you can extract oil, you can do sort of carbon stuff that you can burn, et cetera, et cetera. But most importantly, protein powder that goes into local food in schools, et cetera, et cetera. So creating a local market, and oil, cooking oil for the local market, as opposed to having that low-income populations are spending a lot of money to buy oil that's imported. And my key point being yes, you've got the great star story about integrating into a European brand, but the true impact value is actually that local market, and that's much bigger, and from an impact perspective has even more effect actually than the shiny example. So maintaining that discipline around which one are you going to pick is an important piece, I think, also in our work.
All right. Key success factor that you've seen in your favorite ventures?
So I had a little bit longer to think than you had, but it's actually, but there's going to be a bit of alignment. But what I would say, what's a key factor is, again, I would come back to the team. I think if I look at what I'm most inspired by is some of the CEOs that we work with. So, and then the parts I usually, that inspire me most is that they are so driven to make it work, to make the impact. And they're also decisive when needed, but at the same time, they remained humble and learning a lot. So, for example, one of the impact ventures, Alnar in Indonesia, really has that. Like the CEO really has been growing into the role, and it's amazing to see that he didn't really change. If you look at the personality, and he just is sort of still the same. I'm always surprised because I don't get to see him too often. But he has really this mix of those two things. And it was also needed because when they started, it was about tackling sachets and other flexibles and moving into multiple-use packaging. And everyone said, you're crazy because no FMCG is going to want this. I mean, it's a cash cow to have a sachet, so good luck, you know, like let's talk later. And then it actually happened, and there's the overlap. Like it was working with FMCGs, but also working with the local community, female micro retailers who are now earning more, being part of a zero-waste system. So I think this combination of getting the right people together and the right attitude, that's the part that I see as a key success factor.
Thank you very much. We don't have much time, so I'm gonna hand it over to the two of you to give me a key success factor example.
Really quick. Okay. Very quickly, I think the one thing that's common besides team, which is obviously the main factor, is that they have a business flywheel that really works. And what that means is that they really understand not just their unit economics, but how their sales connects to their operations, connects to their impact, and then generates more sales. And just to reflect on it's literally impossible for me to pick my favorite case. I almost feel guilty like mentioning in a public forum because I don't want to single anybody out. But one of my favorite cases, which many of you may have heard of, is East Africa Foods. And there they have impact on both ends of the value chain, and they also crack their flywheel. So they buy produce from smallholder farmers, have streamlined logistics, and sell it to both informal vendors where they can sell at a lower price, so the informal vendors benefit, but also to hotels, retails, and restaurants where the informal vendors generate quick cash and the Horeca generates higher margins. And so this flywheel just works and they're able to expand quite quickly. And also the team is phenomenal.
Very good. Patrick,
yes,
close.
One of our first investment was in Uganda, northern Uganda, in Arua, in a company called Omia, providing agricultural inputs to local farmers, founded by a local entrepreneur, young person who grew up in poverty and recognized, the potential of helping people by providing training, first of all, increase productivity and incomes, and he has become a role model in a region where there is not a lot of this, entrepreneurship model.
Very exciting sample. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us for this afternoon's panel, and we now conclude the session. Thank you so much.